I'm Benny Zane from Move LA, and we're going to share with you some of what brought us here today to talk with you all about trying to launch a statewide ballot measure in California to help address our crises of air pollution and climate change. We're very, very happy to be partnering today with SPUR, Nick Josefowicz, who you just met, and looking forward to working with Jeremy Madsen and Stuart Cohen to try to build the kind of coalition we need for an extraordinary effort. But let me tell you a bit about how Move LA gets here today. First of all, Eli, move that slide, there you go. Move LA is an organization that started in Los Angeles County back in 2006 to build coalition and sponsor several ballot measures, measures R and M, which were both approved by Los Angeles County voters to yield over $120 billion over 40 years, primarily for transit. We also sponsored Measure H, which will be $3 billion over 10 years for affordable housing and help for the homeless. Our motto is fortune favors the bold. All right, so after our successful efforts in Los Angeles County, we began to think about how we might take this effort larger to Southern California. We approached the South Coast Air District about a possible ballot measure in their 4-county district with the primary purpose of achieving clean air in Southern California to help them meet the attainment goals, federal attainment goals in their clean air efforts. We also wanted to try to create a high velocity commuter rail system, turn Metrolink into a zero emission system throughout the region. But we ran into some problems. This had to be measure in the region had to get legislative approval, authorization, before it could even get started. And that proved to be a challenge. And so we began at that point thinking about, and the challenge was getting through the legislature. Special interests have great weight in the legislature, and we found ourselves blocked there. But in the course of which, we learned some important things. Number one, we were looking at a signature drive measure, which would have needed about 600,000 signatures, plus or minus. Well, it turns out that the statewide measure would need exactly the same number of signatures, or about the same number of signatures. Statewide measure requires 5% of voters who voted in the last governor's race, and a regional measure, 10%. Turns out to be about the same. So we began to think about, well, if that was the case, and a statewide measure did not need legislative authorization and was clearly a majority vote, whereas the regional measure was likely a majority vote, but could yield twice the revenue as a regional measure, that really was a very interesting prospect. Polling done by the South Coast District in the 4-county LA, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino showed that we would get 59 to 65% yes. So we investigated what kind of voting habits voters statewide would have on tax measures for good purposes. And it turns out statewide that we have actually 2 to 3 percentage points consistently above the South Coast District voters. So that was, I think, kind of sealed the deal for us. We had a better electorate, the same number of signatures, twice the revenue, and no need to go to the legislature. So what sort of measure might we think about doing? We thought, well, we would continue with our effort to clean the air, but we would also want to, I think, merge with that effort, since there's so much overlap between clean air and climate change. We would want to see a measure that could conquer climate change, at least our portion of it in California, and truly finally clean our air. First goal then would be roll back climate change. Second goal, finish clean air attainment. Third goal, advance social equity and social justice. And we were cognizant then that California was playing a leading role. In fact, we think that when California leads, especially on climate, when California leads, the world soon follows. This is a breakdown of our where our greenhouse gas emissions come from. You see, electricity is about 15%. Residential and commercial use is about almost 10%. Transportation is 40%. That's the big Megillah here. And industrial related emissions are a little over 20%. So that gives us some guidance as to what sort of priorities we might want to have. So the goal one of rolling back climate change would have, I think, several goals. And they would be, first of all, achieve the targets of 5 million electric vehicles that Governor Brown started. And then also to accelerate the implementation of the recently adopted CARB clean truck rule and the accelerated deployment of zero emission vehicles, et cetera. We want to highlight also the importance of short-lived climate pollutants, powerful sources of global warming forcing. All right, so these short-lived climate pollutants, sometimes called super pollutants, this is a not very widely known or understood problem. They cause about 40% of global warming. We really need to tackle this objective. They include black carbon, methane, biomethane, ozone, HFCs, and these are much more powerful global warming forcing, but they also are very short-lived. For example, methane will stay in the atmosphere about 12 years, but it will decay after 12 years. That's both a powerful challenge, but also an opportunity. We wanted also then, in addition to meeting clean air goals, we wanted to meet the 2030 goal of the special report on global warming from the United Nations IPCC. It said we had basically 2030 to really make a difference. All right. So we wanted to finish clean air attainment goals, and this is really going to be heavily about cleaning up diesel emissions and mobile source emissions as well. A lot of our air districts have done a very good job on the stationary sources, but the mobile sources, especially trucks and off-road equipment, have not been nearly as successful. Of course, we've learned in California in our efforts it's very important that we advance social equity and justice objectives as a top priority goal, truly to shape the way we implement any of our other goals. That would mean, in part, prioritizing investments in, for example, making sure residents in disadvantaged communities have full opportunity to have access to clean technologies and avoid any undue burden. And the good news is most of the technologies we need are already available or almost ready. We need to accelerate their deployment into the marketplace. Now, there are several possible revenues. We gained a couple of revenue sources, and we figured we could reach 2.7 billion in the first year, which would grow to 30 billion over the first decade, and then more beyond as well. So the question becomes, what are the most equitable and most likely to produce sufficient revenue that can win voter support? We got to win. This chart shows you what the South Coast Air District thought might be able to be accomplished. And a takeaway from this slide is look at all of that, those categories of equipment and mobile sources could be invested in, many of which would be brought to zero in the first decade, certainly in 2 decades. And imagine we had entirely zero emission mobile sources. California has the 5th largest economy. So we know that if we were to do this here, it would be transformational for our nation and potentially for our world. We need to reach economies of scale in order to make this happen. And that's the secret sauce. And this kind of investment program can do it. So this is the timeline. We're ready to go, starting right now. Coalition convening by March 2021.
When Denny asks me to participate in one of his convenings, I don't think I ever have said no. And the reason for this is actually pretty simple. Aside from the fact that I've known him for a long time and know him to be a very effective and progressive political strategist, I also believe that what he's about is what we need to be talking about right now. And that is how to raise a boatload of money, that's a technical term, to facilitate the transition that we know needs to happen. So in my mind, the ballot initiative has to be really big, and it also has to be long-term enough so that it will attract private investors, because this can't all be done. No, nothing that we're talking about can be solely financed by public funds. I think it needs to be designed with input and carefully thought through in a way that will make it as useful as possible in convincing private investors that they need to be coming in and putting money into California for a lot of the new facilities and new technologies that we need to have.
And Denny, I salute you because you have legitimately combined what most people do in their own mind of talking about air quality and climate change is all one issue that they care about. Every year, the PPIC poll put out in July shows that Californians support these policies to reduce air pollution and to support climate policies. And they want us to do more. I mean, it's 60 to 70% across all demographic groups and regionally speaking, and it's really extraordinary. It went for the first time down a little just the last 3 years. I'm sure it's just a coincidence on the Republican end of it, but still over a majority. So we get it here in California. Not only our lifestyle that we treasure depends on this investment.
So I have a question.
So connected to public health. And I'll just finish off with the mobile emissions and second, the short-lived climate pollutants. That's been a frustration for all of us. This is the challenge in reaching SB 32 targets by 2030. We have to do more in this space and accelerate what we do.
All right, so short-lived climate pollutants is a top priority, as well as mobile sources. Very good. Thank you, Pran. Thank you for your leadership.
I've been focused a lot on waste reduction and management and energy efficiency because, as Mary pointed out, we've got some very defensible 2050 goals that are backed by all of the science. But if you really study those goals carefully, you realize that if we don't make a sufficient down payment on those goals in the next 10 years, honestly, what happens after that might not matter. The planetary forces will take over and release methane from the poles and other kinds of things where we won't really have much control. The forest fires will get worse, releasing more methane, et cetera, or more greenhouse gases rather, and black carbon pollution and so forth, that we won't be able to control our future. So I've been very focused on the short-term solutions that would also therefore focus on the super pollutants because of their short-lived nature and immediacy. But that said, if we're not also making the down payments we need on transportation, which I think this measure would do in spades, and I'm a big fan of what you've put together here, I think this is exactly the right measure we need, and I'll mention a couple things about that if time permits. But because the average vehicle, last time I looked, when somebody buys one in California, stays on the road for 18 years. And probably even longer if it gets sold off to another state or Mexico or what have you, where it might have yet another life. So getting moving on funding this transition to a clean transportation system faster. The down payment in some ways has already been made. As Mary mentioned, there's a lot of charging infrastructure. There's already a lot of battery cars. We're now starting to see hydrogen pick up, as you mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. But that's not going to be enough to meet even the 2030 goals on the path to 2050 without more funding. And that's again where I think this measure is so crucial. When I was a regulator, industry would come to me all the time and say, look, of course we don't like fees, we don't like regulation, but if you're going to do it, give us time to adapt. Let us plan our business plans. Let us have certainty. Don't change it every year or whenever. And there's nothing more uncertain, of course, than the price of fossil fuels, 5 years ago, it was $150 a barrel for oil. Then earlier this year, it was negative several dollars a barrel. People were being paid to take oil. And so there's nothing more uncertain about that. But on the other hand, it's uncertain for vehicle owners if they can't charge their vehicle, if they can't recycle a battery, if they don't have really good options for buying clean transportation choices, whether it's heavy duty or light duty. And of course, when it comes to things like hydrogen, having fueling stations and and the vehicles on the road, which we're now seeing an increase in as well, and lots of benefits there. And I'll just say briefly, because I know time is an issue here on hydrogen, I do want to mention that, as Mary said, it's starting to gain traction, in part because batteries will only take us so far. I think they're in the lead early because it's a familiar technology, and people can plug in at home or at work to a large degree. But the vast majority of people actually live in multifamily homes or other places where they can't just plug in. So I think when the market for battery electrics has been saturated, if people want zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, they're going to be looking for another source of onboard fuel, which again, hydrogen vehicles are electric vehicles. They just use a different source of storing the energy on board. So I do think that's where that's going to pick up and continue the progress.
So whatever we do, and the whole suite of policies as well as regulatory moves, as well as moving forward ballot initiatives, whether it be at the local level, whether it be at the statewide level, or combination thereof, we have to do it with a sense of urgency, because we frankly have no time to waste. And we shouldn't put our eggs in a basket thinking that perhaps a Biden administration also, will accelerate this. We in California need to continue to be the national as well as world leaders. If we get Biden to win come November 3rd, that will be a big plus where we can collaborate and cooperate with DOE, Department of Energy, accelerate renewable energy as well as the EPA. But getting to the bottom line, obviously, Los Angeles, still is, relatively has done a much better job with regards to air quality and attainment, but it's relative because it still is 10 years in a row consecutively the most polluted city in America. And we know that these very consequential health impacts have a disproportionate impact on children, especially children of color, those of the lowest economic means. So one, what I would do is, first order of business is get diesel trucks off the road. You've got to get diesel trucks off the road. Second is you got to build out, charging infrastructure for passenger cars. The infrastructure has to be there. Terry was talking about infrastructure, especially when it comes to hydrogen. I'm not picking winners or losers between electric, clean electrons or hydrogen. I think I like it all. I like all the above. I think all investments should be made so we can have diversity. But I think it's absolutely critical that infrastructure is built out, and it's absolutely critical, especially in low-income communities throughout the state of California. What comes first, the chicken, or the egg? That infrastructure has to be built out. I also would add a robust cash incentive program, rebate program for those of lowest economic means, which is absolutely critical. But I want to put this in context because I think that within what I would call the climate intelligentsia elite, there tends to be a belief that, when it comes to the issue of equity, that's sort of kind of an add-on, if you will. We got to do all the good big stuff, and then we will deal with equity. What I try to do, and Mary made reference to it with Senate Bill 535, and we worked together when I was both in the Assembly as well as the Senate on 535, and providing a floor and a cap in terms of incentives from the auction revenues from cap and trade, is that we'd be truly mistaken if we approach this sort of as an add-on. It has to be hardwired because the working class is sizable in California. In fact, much more sizable than the very wealthy, the upper middle class, as well as the middle class. So if you're driving an antiquated vehicle that is spewing a lot of pollution, and you don't have the financial, wherewithal to access the latest and greatest technology, nor is the infrastructure ubiquitous like a gas station in and around your neighborhoods, that we have to make a concerted effort that's very intentional and purposeful. So what I believe is, as early adopters adopt the earliest technologies because they can adopt early because they have the financial wherewithal to do so. Well, we as a state should be, incentivize early adoption of low-income families to access these types of technologies. Obviously, it may not be a high price, Tesla X, or the latest and greatest hydrogen fuel cell, vehicle, but it will be, an electric vehicle nonetheless. So I think that's absolutely critical in terms of adopting zero emissions vehicle.
On the other thing that I feel we need to invest in critically is green hydrogen. We are now, thank you, Kevin De Leon, thank you, Senator Pavley, thank you so many of us. We are on track for 100% generation of electricity from renewable sources, but we already have a situation where during certain times of the day, we are producing excess electricity from our solar and other sources. We could use that excess electricity to produce green hydrogen. Then we would have a zero emission hydrogen source. Hydrogen is the most flexible of all of our power sources, whether for transportation fuel, for storage, you name it, we've got to move in that direction. And I would put a significant investment there. Plus, it's equitable because we already have infrastructure for hydrogen, because we have a natural gas infrastructure and we have a other gas infrastructure. So we can utilize it in that infrastructure.
Point of view, what that means in the context of the bond measure is really empowering local communities, disadvantaged communities, and all communities to be a part of the transformation of a clean economy on the ground and what that actually looks like. So what that means is thinking about new ways to fund and prioritize clean vehicle strategies, transit-oriented investments, and more participatory mechanisms for both researching the effects and impacts of climate change and how greenhouse gas emissions can be reduced in one's own community, as well as funding the real projects. It's been mentioned beforehand, but I think it is so important that we continue to innovate really with regard to how we think about the functioning of our government and responsiveness to disadvantaged communities and empowering those communities. To get to the point though, and I think certainly an incredibly important one with regard to land use, and Senator Skinner, to thank you again for raising it. I would echo wholeheartedly the importance of not forgetting about land use over the longer term and transforming both where and how we live to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, vehicle miles traveled, and adapt to climate change. And so what that looks like from the standpoint of this bond, first of all, funding sustainable community strategies. They've been built out by region, and as Mary mentioned at the top of this talk, they have been short funding for a whole host of reasons. We need to focus on and ensure that we focus on pathways for our labor force, our workers, to ensure that good quality jobs are attached to what this clean economy looks like. And that transition through all of these investments, working with our regional partners, with businesses, with regional economic development plans, as we're building these investments, that needs to be a critical part of getting there, because I think building the buy-in for a clean economy transformation depends on it. So thank you again.
A lot of our air pollution problem, aside from this horrible wildfire smoke that we're getting, the majority of our air pollution problem really is coming from transportation. And what's particularly toxic is the diesel exhaust that is coming primarily not from the movement of people, but the movement of goods. And that's why we at the Coalition for Clean Air focus a lot of our efforts on cleaning up goods movement, the trucks, the locomotives, the cargo handling equipment that are moving our goods. And as both Kevin De Leon and Nancy Skinner said, we need to get rid of that petroleum diesel as soon as possible and replace it with those cleaner alternatives, the zero emission trucks Where we don't yet have zero emission alternatives, like for example, the locomotive sector, we can go to engines that are much cleaner than the ones that we have now while we're working towards that zero emission solution.
Here, that in any kind of design of a funding mechanism, of a program delivery, or of a regulatory process, we really have to center equity in ways that not only influence kind of what the goal and the mission of our process is, but actually it thinks about how do we include equity in the way that we're making decisions in our process. What is our procedural equity that we're thinking about advancing? Then what is our implementation equity? What kind of equity outcomes are we really looking to advance and achieve so that people in those communities receive direct, meaningful, and measurable benefits? And then finally, how do we make sure that we have current accurate accounting for equity? What is our evaluation process and analysis related to that equity goal so that we make sure that we are making progress along those lines?
For me, the bulk of this money would be like looking at like, how are we, you know, actually creating like evaluation systems of like our current transportation funding, our current transportation agencies? How are we looking at like implicit bias? How are we looking at like racial justice? How are we looking at like changing the planning? And like, you know, how that happens, that it's not this top-down kind of process. And I think on top of that, how are we looking at even the projects that are being funded and what programs are getting the bulk of our money? Like at this point, should highways and local streets and roads be getting the bulk of the money if we have these very ambitious climate goals? And are we thinking about, you know, in terms of like, you know, our revenue sources, should it be gas and diesel excise tax as our revenue source? And if it's not those things, where are we creating the infrastructure to actually think about and critically go to the next step of like what it should be? And so for me, some of this ballot measure money is doing that work. And then I think it also does go to that implementation around the scoping plan, as I mentioned before. It goes into like kind of like the housing and I think those pieces as well too. But I just think there's a big part of me that feels like we can often have these very big goals and not think about the obstacles. And so there needs to be some planning and some kind of identification of like, where are the obstacles going to happen? How are we going to plan against that? And how are we addressing, you know, this like racial injustice and inequity that we've seen and that we perpetuated in our transportation systems?
$30 billion is a down payment, nothing more. That's a starting point to do serious change at the rate and scale that's needed. And it's a starting point for a couple of reasons. One, as somebody who's worked with folks on this call on regional measures in places like LA County that have generated over $100 billion, that's what we're looking at for a state of our scale and with our need and how far behind we are right now in climate action and climate justice. I'd also say that the reality is, because of our lack of action to this point, that just has not quite been sufficient. As good as it's been by measuring ourselves against other states or other countries, if we're measuring ourselves against what communities are feeling and being burdened with right now and what science tells us we have to do, it is not nearly enough. And that's what we have to be measuring ourselves against. And seeing just the wildfires radically increase carbon emissions, it's throwing a complete wrench in our carbon emission goals. What we used to be able to rely on as our carbon sinks in the state to really clean our air, now it's quite arguably could turn into net carbon emitters and give the transportation sector a run of its money in terms of being the largest emitter. So this needs to just radically shift the way we're thinking about this and what is possible. The silver lining here is that it changes what's possible based on what people are feeling and what we can do politically. And I really appreciate Chanel highlighting that we absolutely need to kind of get out of our box of business as usual. These are the things, and we need to kind of radically think a lot bigger to protect our future. So really see this as big, significant, and just a down payment.
Well, I'm leaving this discussion more excited than when I started it. And thank you all for joining us and the opportunity we've had. We've learned a lot. We're going to turn this into a document that can be shared. We will send out links to the program so that others who weren't here can see it, or if you want to see it again, you have a chance. I would like to emphasize what Nick said. This is the beginning of a process. We're going to do this several more times, different configurations of participants and somewhat different focuses, all leading toward coalition building and measure drafting ultimately. Looking forward to November 2022. Obviously, we will do things like polling and the like in 2021, try to sharpen our understanding of the political possibilities, but we think they're good, we think they're high, we think we're on to something important. We want to thank you all for joining us.